an Indian economist and international civil servant. He received a bachelor's degree from the University of Bombay in 1962, and in 1965, he earned a master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He was Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs of United Nations from 1992 to 2003. Very warm welcome, sir. We are privileged to have you here in virtual mode with us. So excited to listen to you and learn from your experiences. Now, I would request our respected convener, Dr. Arnav sir, to welcome our guest and share a few words of wisdom.
Good morning, sir, and good morning, students. Sir, we are a very small college, but we are located in Delhi, and we have been striving to make efforts to spread the light of knowledge and interaction. You would be happy to know, sir, that since last year, we have trained over 1 lakh teachers, students in various online programs, taking opportunity of the challenges that have been thrown up during this pandemic. And sir, as part of this ongoing journey, we had also conceived of inviting eminent speakers for a conclave on finance and economics. And our first thoughts were about you, sir, and you kindly accepted the invitation at a short notice. And students are very excited, and we have participants, mostly students, some professionals also, some researchers also, and faculty members, including senior teachers from our college. So I gladly welcome you, sir, and I will not take more time. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to talk to you. We are now living in COVID times, so we are getting used to this business of talking in virtual mode. And in some ways, it's very nice because I could have accepted short notice because I'm doing it from home. So there's no great difficulty in just finding an hour for all of you. So there are some plus points in this lockdown that we have. We're not a lockdown, the curfew that we are living with. But it's a pleasure for me to be here. And in many ways, let me begin first by the focus of what I will say today. Normally, when you talk about finance, you tend to focus on the immediate short-term problems, the NPAs of banks and this and that and so on and so forth. What I'm concerned with is that young people like you have to really look at what is the financial system going to be like 10 years from now. That is when you will be in the swim of things, and it's good for you to know what will that be like, and it will not be necessarily like what it is today. So this is why the focus of my talk to you today is going to be on finance for development, is what I've called it. Is basically an exploration of what are the changes, significant changes that we can expect in the financial system as we know it today. Let us say 10 years from now. 10 years is not so fixed. It can be even less. It can be even a little bit more in certain cases, maybe a bit less actually. So let me just begin with that. And I'll be doing most of my talking in the form of PowerPoint. So this is just an introductory slide. Let's just leave that to one side and move to the next one. So when you talk about changes in financial markets in the long term, what is a financial market? A financial market is a market where somebody borrows, somebody lends. And therefore, what you have to look for is what are the long-term changes that you expect to see in the savings side, mainly household savings, and on the borrowing side, which is where the people who are producing goods and services, and what are the nature of the borrowing requirements that will change. If you look at a country which is moving from an agricultural to an industrial country, as we are, from a rural to an urban country, as we are, what are the changes that you expect to see? In a rural economy, what we call savings are generally really the direct investments made by, say, farmers, small producers directly in their business. That's called direct investment. And what you see as the country urbanizes, as it moves from rural to urban, from agriculture to industrial, is a shift between financial savings and direct investments. Second, there is a change in the preferences of financial assets, types of financial assets people want in terms of the profile and volatility. Normally, a farmer wants something which is liquid, which he can easily cash. He's not a person who likes to speculate on stock markets or any such thing. But as you go into an urban environment, into an industrial environment, the preferences change. On the borrowing requirement side, there's a very significant shift from working capital to fixed investments. The biggest requirement of capital, say in agriculture, is working capital. Yes, you do have some fixed investment requirements for power, water pumps, etc. But the main investment is requirement is of working capital. This changes as you move into a more industrial environment, into more requirements of fixed investment, where the money is locked up for months, not just for a year. This also implies a change in the time horizon of investments. The time horizon of investments typically in agriculture is on an annual basis. Whereas when you get into industry, you have to look ahead at decades if necessary. And also then this generates scope for new entrepreneurs. Now, if I were to look at the Indian experience, and I've tried to just to summarize it in giving you numbers for every 30 years, so to speak, 50-51, 80-81, 50-51, 80-81, 2010 and 11. Now, as you can see, the big change that you see in the savings side is that household direct in 1950-51, of the total savings, the bulk was in terms of households' direct physical savings in their own enterprises, and very little in the form of financial savings. Private corporations had some modest savings, under 1%, and those, of course, government savings because of this, the taxation and so on. It starts changing quite dramatically you see in 80-81 and now 2010-11, how the huge and substantial increase in the financial savings of households, the shift from physical to financial savings, which are now equal. They were less than 10% of total savings. Now they're more than 10, half of savings. You also see a big increase in the savings of private corporations from less than 1% of GDP to over 10% of GDP. And that change, incidentally, one thing I would point out is it really comes afterwards. In fact, most of it came after 1991. Even in 1980-81, the savings of private corporations had not gone all that much up over 30 years, from 0.9 to 1.4. And public sector savings is okay, it's up, but nothing very dramatic there. If you see investments, now you see 1950-51, the bulk of the investment was in the household sector, not in private corporations or in the public sector. And how that changes over time, and how dramatic is the change in which you see in 2010-11. It has started changing in 80-81, mainly with the public sector accounting for a very large share of total investment. What is the change that you see in 2010-11 is a very substantial increase in the private sector share, from 3% to 12% of GDP. I've just given this to you to give you a sense of how substantial are the changes if you look at the financial structure over a longer term horizon. What are the changes that I expect to see? Looking ahead at the next decade, looking ahead at the next 2-3 decades, if you like. One, a continued shift from the direct accumulation of physical assets to financial savings. So, this is something which has been happening. This will happen as enterprises get a little more organized and are not just run as family companies, family enterprises, a family shop or something like that. The second is an increase in savings for retirement. Because as more, if you are own your own business, you don't retire. You don't retire. What is happening? You don't retire. You basically live on the what you earn from your own enterprise, whether it's a shop, whether it's a farm. But as the number of wage and salary earners starts increasing, they retire at 60, 65, whatever it is. And at that point, something's happening. Some little marks are coming up. I don't know how is that coming up. This increase in savings for retirement comes from the wage and salary earners who, when they finish their job, have to have some source of income. And that's the second big change that you're going to see as the proportion of wage and salary earners increases. The third big change that I expect to see on the savings side is there is a growing number of high net worth individuals. Investments in stock markets generally comes from people, not because they're saving for retirement, but because they have savings which are a little bit more than what they need for saving for retirement or saving for buying a house or saving for their children's education or something. And those people are basically high net worth individuals. If I look at the stock markets in India, they are the major investors. So these are the three big changes that I expect to see as we move ahead in the more or less on the trends that we have seen. The one new element would be probably an increase in the proportion of investment in shares and so on. This is household savings as a percentage of the gross national disposable income, which is more or less roughly the same as GDP. And you can see that it has actually declined in the past decade from the 2011 to a thing of over 23% to under 20% in 2019-20. And the bulk of the decline is not in the dark blue line, which are the savings in financial assets, which have not gone up much as a proportion of gross national disposable income, but have not gone down. And what has gone down is the balance. This, which was purely 13% nearly of gross income in 2011-12, has come down to something which is under 9%, under almost just about 8% of GDP in 2019-20. This is the big difference, the decline in the direct investment in physical assets, basically by small enterprises, farmers, etc. This is part of the trend that you're going to see in future anyhow. If I look at the gross financial savings of households, what I see is if the pattern of the recent times, and it has not changed that much over the last decade. You see that there is, of course, about currency and deposits, fixed deposits in banks, etc., is the biggest chunk. Shares and debentures is quite modest. And the other big chunk is what I call savings for retirement, life insurance, provident, and pension funds, which are around 4% of GDP. What should I expect them to be? What would be a reasonable guess as to what they would be? So I've done a little theoretical calculation. Let us say that people are you're saving 10% of your income for retirement in provident fund, pensions, life insurance, etc., or 15%, two possible options. That the money that you save when you start working will earn interest over the 30, 40 years that you're working. What is that interest? I've taken two numbers. One number is 3%. This is the real rate of return. After all, what matters to you is what is the real worth of your assets and how much real income will you get, because after all, you want income to buy yourself necessities and so on. And 3% is the real rate of return on time deposits. I take the time deposit rate, 5-year time deposit rate of banks from 80-81 to now, and deduct from it the increase in the world, in the wholesale price index, the average return works out to around 3%. So if you got the 3%, what would be the value of your assets, which have been earning 3% per year from the time you started savings, at the end of your retirement, say 40 years later? It will be about 25% of your starting income, or 37% of your starting income, if it was, if you were saving 15%. And if you were then to get 3% on this, what would be your income as a proportion of your retirement salary? It would be 7 to 10% of your retirement salary. Suppose you earn not a return not of 3, but 6%. That's let's say the average growth of the economy. Then that same number would be 42% or 63%, giving you 24 to 36, allowing you a income as a proportion of your retirement income, which is the highest level that you'll attain 40 years later, of between 25 and 37%. This is what it would look like. What is it like? What is the actual number like? Right now, the share of wage and salary earners in gross national disposable income is 30%. 70% accrues to people who are not wage and salary earners, who are getting the income basically as profits or as income from their small enterprises. This is the average for the last decade. If 15% of wage and salary income is contributed for retirement benefits, the savings for this purpose will be 4.5% of GDP. This is more or less comparable to the number I was showing you earlier, where savings for insurance, provident funds, and so on was around 4% of GDP. You have to allow for the fact that some people who are wage and salary earners are probably not saving as much. Let me here qualify what I'm saying a little. Savings for retirement is not the only reason why people save during their working life. They have to save to buy a house, they have to save to educate their children, they have to save to, and these days with the sort of expenses you incur, save to get your children married. Anyhow, this is all, but those are additional elements. The biggest reason for savings for wage and salary earners is to see that they have an adequate income when they retire. So this is the reason why I'm saying, I'm suggesting that as the proportion of wage and salary earners increases with the growth in organized manufacturing and services, this percentage, 30%, which I here, will go up very much. And if that 30% goes up, this 4.5% will also go up. And this will become a big, important component of savings. And I'm stressing this because I think one of the major areas that we need is advisory services to people who are saving for retirement. And let me see what we are actually doing. This is a number on the life insurance premium. Remember this is not the only thing that comes out for savings for retirement. Besides life insurance premium, there's also provident fund, and I'll come to the next one, the national pension scheme, in a moment. And you can see that it did go up quite high in the boom years of the 2004 to 2008, but it's back to around between 2 and 3% of GDP. And the amount is around the equivalent of $58 per capita. The reason that the numbers are in dollars is because these numbers are taken from an international comparison. By international comparisons, the use of life insurance in India is still quite low. And part of the reason for this is such a large chunk of our people are not in wage and salary earning things, but They're simply running small enterprises, a matter which we'll come to a little later. The new thing that has entered the picture here is called the National Pension System. This is something which was started by the government in 2004 for government servants. I was a government servant, and when I retired, I got a pension as part of my right. I had not contributed, nor had the government. It was something which was considered part of my right as part of a wage contract. Now, after 2004, the system has been changed. And the pension is, the government employees were made part of a national pension scheme where they contributed something, the government contributed something, and at the end of their retirement, they would then get a pension based on the contributions that had been put in. This was opened up to all citizens in 2009. It has certain tax advantages, like the exemptions of the money that you put into the national pension scheme. 40% of the total that you get when you retire will also escape majority. As of now, end of December, at the end of last year, the number of subscribers was 14 million, and the assets were around 5.3 trillion rupees. That is 5.3 lakh crores. But most of this is still accounted for by government employees. 85%, only 15% are people who are not government employees. I think this is an area which will develop and grow. It's a very flexible area, and this is one of the things that we may see emerging over time. So this is what I would expect on the savings to retirement side. Much more interest in things like life insurance premium, more interest in things like the national pension system. And of course, you have the provident fund system for organized sector workers, and the proportion of organized sector workers is likely to go up. So this is the reason why I was expecting this to become a more and more important component of savings. In some ways, it is quite important, this component, because savings for retirement is long-term savings. Somebody who's saving, buys a life insurance premium, is not just going to cash it all at once. It is money that is available to the life insurance companies for long-term investments. Because when I buy a life insurance policy at the age of, say, 25, 30, for 30 years, I'm not going to cash it in advance. And therefore, the money that I'm putting in is available to the life insurance company for long-term investments, which is quite important when we come later to the issue of infrastructure investments. The second area of growth change that I expect to see is in the stock market. And that is mainly because of my expectation about high net worth individuals. The number of high net worth individuals is quite high in India. You can see the numbers here. There are about over 2 lakh people. The definition of high net worth individuals internationally is any family with assets of over $1 million, excluding the house they live in and personal assets like jewelry and so on. But basically, fungible assets, tradable assets, is around over 260,000 right now. If you look at the figures on the mutual funds, 1/3 of the mutual funds are owned by high net worth individuals. 40% are owned by corporations, and only about 20% are owned by others. So they are quite an important component. Where do we get these high net worth individuals? Are they just people who own their own businesses? In this case, they'll keep investing in their own business. Why in the stock market? No. They are people who have made money from stock ownership. There are people who have made money from real estate gains. These days, you're also getting people with very high earnings at the top corporate management level. Their salaries have started running into even 1 crore of rupees. And the new thing which is coming in is a very rapid capital appreciation that you see of startups, a question that we will also come to a little later. These are the people who are high net worth individuals, the infotech millionaires in Bangalore, for instance. Now, only 25% of this wealth is professionally managed. More than 75% is not. This is why I think the advising individuals on their savings is likely to be a major area of opportunity for people who are entering the financial sector as new entrants for either jobs or for as in enterprises. If you see the stock market behavior, actually, this is not very crucially relevant to my argument. You will see that there's a big boom in market capitalization in the boom years from 2005 to about 2008. The market capitalization as a percentage of GDP was more or less typically around 40% of GDP. It shot up to nearly 80% of GDP. It's sort of stabilized at between 75 and 80% of GDP since then. But this boom came with that 2004-2008 boom that we saw. But still, savings in shares and debentures as a percentage of GDP it shot up in the 90s briefly. Otherwise, it has remained around between 0.5% and 1% of GDP. It has not changed that much. But I believe it will go up as the number of high net worth individuals increases, as they start getting more professional advice for the management of their assets, as more and more of them are really not people running their own businesses, but just people who happen to have a lot of wealth. Let me now turn to the second side. I've talked about how I expect savings. I expect to see how I expect savings to go up. And now I want to focus on how, so I was a little disturbed here, how I expect investments to go up. The changing pattern of investments that I would expect to see, let me take four different areas. The first is the growing role of the private sector in infrastructure due to two things. One, if you see electricity, there's a proportion of renewables energy is increasing very rapidly. And almost all renewable energy investment is by private sector people. They're also investing in larger plants and so on. But the big increase in the share of the private sector in energy is very much on the renewable side. That is going to go up very much. Second, there's a whole program of monetization of public sector assets, which has been launched. And that is going to, what are the public sector assets? Are basically infrastructure type assets. And that will increase the role of the private sector in infrastructure. The second area of investment is a normal corporate investment in manufacturing and services, which comes from retained earnings, and the sources of the funds there come from retained earnings, stock market issues, private equity, foreign investment, and so on. I don't expect that to change that much. The areas that I would expect to see changes, would like to see changes, is in the more formal financing for micro, medium, and small enterprises. And the one really interesting area in India, the more domestic financing for innovative startups. The startup economy ecosystem in India is really moving ahead quite rapidly, and I would expect to see changes there. So let me quickly turn to these four things. Infrastructure as an investment as a proportion of GDP has, it sort of fluctuates between 8 and 6%. You don't see a sharp upward trend as yet. And this is investment in electricity, utilities, etc., as reported in national accounts. This is a share of the public sector. It went up briefly in 2014, 15, 16, but it's basically around 40%. And the rest is from the public sector. But there's a big difference in if I compare electricity and other utilities and other infrastructure areas. In the case of electricity and other utilities, 2/3 of the investment comes from the public sector, not 1/3 from the private sector. I think this 1/3 of the private sector will go up quite substantially. And if I look at the other infrastructure areas, transport, communication, and storage, then the public sector is only 15%. Private sector is 55%, and direct investment by households in transport, communication, and storage is as much as 30%. So this is basically a public sector, not a public sector area. It is really a private sector area, this area of investment. And what do I expect? The changes I expect. As I mentioned earlier, the big change I expect is how solar, Aditi, the solar, wind, and other renewable energy investments are largely in the private sector, and their capacity is expected to go up very sharply from 90 megawatts to 175 megawatts to 2020 to 75 megawatts by 2027. And now we've announced a goal of 450 gigawatts. Sorry, this is my mistake. It's not a megawatts, it's gigawatts. By 2030. This is why this is an area where I would expect to see the 2/3 investment of the public sector to come down, share of private sector to go up. The big area of change is the monetization of public assets, which includes the sale of shares in public enterprises, including outright privatization for some, as they're trying with Air India. The sale of unused assets, like unused land owned by government. And what is very interesting is the sale of completed revenue or earning projects, like a toll road. So the government has built a toll road. Tolls are being earned. Now they will encash that. What they say is, okay, now this is available to any private investor, and they will bid for it. And the private investor is interested because it's a very safe investment. There's a steady income from the tolls which will be coming in, and this is something that they like. And the government then gets cash in its hands, which it can use for further investments. So these are the reasons why I've said that I expect to see substantial increases in the role of the private sector in infrastructure investments, which generates a type of requirement for borrowing, which is very different from what we have now. Because infrastructure investments are long-term. If I buy a toll road, I'll be buying a toll road where I'll be committing myself for 30 years or so. So this is why, because it's long-term, you require long-term financing. Much of that has come from banks and has led to the problem of non-performing assets, which really arose because we had a slightly inadequately designed public-private partnership infrastructure program in the 90s, where these guys came in for infrastructure investments without proper preparation. The banks were not well organized, but really evaluating the risks involved, and that's why they're non-performing assets. So what we need is here something which will provide infrastructure investment, resources for infrastructure investment by private sector, without running into the types of risks that we ran into with the old PPP system, which has led to non-performing assets in banks. This will happen perhaps through the development of corporate bonds, perhaps by better organization of financial intermediaries. But this is an area of growth and change that I expect to see. When it comes to the second area, the corporate investments, I don't expect to see big changes. As a proportion of GDP, this is what the pink figure is what their savings was. This is what their investment was. The difference between the savings and investment is the demand they make on household savings, for instance. And as you can see, that gap has started narrowing because gross fixed investments by corporates has been falling. And now the bulk of it was financed by retained earnings in 2019-20. If I see their investments, which was a little under around 11%, More than little over 9% was finance of that came from their own savings, and the demand on the financial market for borrowings was very, very modest compared to this. I don't expect to see dramatic changes in this area, but I do expect to see and hope to see a rise in the corporate investment and therefore rise in the borrowing requirements. The big area of change is really what I want to focus on for the next 5-10 minutes. One is in the micro, small, and medium enterprises. They account for nearly 30% of the national income, but they are very poorly financed and organized ways. Of the total number of MSMEs, about 56 million, only 8 million are registered, nearly 48 million are not registered. Of this 56 million, around 12 million are in manufacturing and have potential to become much larger, and 44 million are in services. Well, a lot of it is really small shops, etc., and so on. If you look at their ownership structure, they are run as mostly proprietorships, as you can see from these numbers. There's hardly any organized as a company. They're roughly distributed a third between manufacturing, trading, which is wholesale and retail trading, and other services, maybe transport or things like that. And employment also is more or less 1/3 each in each of these three areas. Where do they get their money from? The total supply of debt, the amount of debt that they had mobilized, this is a 2018 report, was around nearly 70 lakh crores. But of that, only around 11 lakh crores came from formal sources, and the rest came from informal sources. And the formal sources were banks, non-bank financial companies, other banks, government institutions. The informal sources were family members, friends, etc., but highly informal with very poor evaluation of what the money is being made available for, and also probably very high interest rates if it was borrowed from the informal borrowing market. This is where I would expect to see significant change. Much larger proportion of this has to come from these organized sector institutions. And this is one area of change that is absolutely essential, because the real potential for growth in India in many ways is for these micro, small, and medium enterprises to become larger. And they will not become larger unless they have access to organized sources of finance and not informal sources as they're dependent on right now. So this is one big area of change that I expect to see on the investment side. The other area of change is on startups. Now, startups are quite different in some ways from your traditional micro, small, and medium enterprises. They are typically in new areas, particularly in areas like info technology, or it may be in areas where there's a new business model, for instance, in logistics or so on. And the amount of the deals that have been struck by some of these people has really shot up to now around nearly $8 billion in 2019. 2020, the COVID year is a very special case, so I'm leaving that to one side. What is a startup? When I start up a small company with a bright idea, I initially need seed fund to establish the credibility of my idea. This is where what we call angel investors come in. If I don't succeed in establishing the credibility of my idea, I'll be out. This is called the value of debt. Now, at this point, I have set up the thing, it is breaking even. And at this point, when I'm breaking even, so that I'm established that I'm not completely a foolish idea, then the small VCs start coming in. And this is the early stage financing. And once I've really improved my revenue earnings from the break-even stage here, to the much better stage here, so that I look viable, then the larger VC, venture funds, private equity funds, or other people who come and acquire this. So there's a very typical thing in infotech. I set up something which is in e-marketing, then Amazon will come and buy me up. I set up something which is in social media, then Facebook or somebody will come and buy me up. That's where the M&A part comes in, or there may be mergers. And then when this gets established, and then soon you get into IPOs, which is very necessary because this is how these guys make money. They get their stake at a very low price, and they expect these companies to boom and sell their stake at a much higher price later. This is your start. Now, India is one of the third largest ecosystems for startups. Sorry, my typing is a little shaky here. It is already home to unicorns. Unicorns are companies with valuations of over 1 billion. We have 32 unicorns now in the country with a total valuation of over 100 billion. And the startups have raised a lot of money. The median age, the age of the people, of the founders, is just 31 years. This is the area of opportunity for youngsters. On average, each of these startups created 12 jobs, or about 350,000 jobs, according to the estimates made by the government. This is the system which is likely to develop very rapidly, because we have the technical potential for new startups. We have the entrepreneurial potential for the new startups. What we need is a financial system which will support this. What we need is high net worth individuals to become angel investors. What we need is venture capital funds which are domestic, both small and large ones. Today, much of this startup funding is coming from foreign venture funds, not from Indian high net worth individuals. Some of them have started showing an interest, and this has changed a little over the past 5 years or so, but we need much more of this. And for this, we will have to see whether we need to design a fiscal system, incentives, which will persuade high net worth individuals to take the risks involved in supporting a startup in its early stages as angel investors or as early stage venture capital funds. To me, this is one of the critical areas of development that is necessary in India, which I hope will come. And I see signs that this is likely to happen. So these are the two big areas that. So if I look at the investment side, and if I look at the sectoral pattern of startups, it's e-commerce, fintech, health tech, there's lots of different things. Education may come up also. Now that we've had 1 year of people studying at home, you may find that like Beju or something, startups in the education sector may start booming. So these are some of the areas of opportunity which are there. So this is really the picture that I wanted to present to you. So let me just conclude then by saying that my purpose in presenting this to you was the changes that will take place on savings side and on the investment side is to give you a sense of what are the opportunities which are likely to be there 10 years from now in the finance business. And this is why, in many ways, it's necessary to look ahead. So to summarize, I expect to see a big shift in savings, more towards savings for retirement. I expect to see more high net worth individuals coming into the stock market. On the investment side, there is a big change on the infrastructure investment, which is demands for long-term financing. There will have to be, and I hope there will be, significant changes in organized financing of medium, small, and medium and enterprises. And I hope also much more domestic financing for startups that is available now. So let me stop here now. And if there are any questions, I'm sorry I've taken longer than I expected, but there is a little time for questions and I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Now we proceed with the question and answers. I have some question to ask from you. And also those who want to ask any question can write in the chat box. So, sir, the first question is, how can we reduce unemployment given the limited industrialization of the country?
The only answer to reducing unemployment is to get rid of the limits on industrialization, to understand better what are these limits? Why is it that we have not grown in the way? One key area is exports. If you look at countries which have had a rapid manufacturing industry growth, you will see that it cannot be done, even if you're a large country. Take China. China is as large as we are. But the foundation of the manufacturing growth was phenomenal export growth. What does export growth require? It means that we need to keep our industries competitive on a global scale. That means more investments in training, more investments in technology, and so on. So I think we have to Atmanirbharta today is not just producing things for myself, but producing things for the global market, because that's the only way I'm going to get rapid manufacturing growth. So that is a historical experience of almost every country in the world. The only countries which have not had that are the countries which went over it slowly. I want rapid progress. The second area is services. Infotech is a very good example of an area where India's competitive advantage, because of its skills, because of its talents, gave it a very significant space in the international space. Today, some of the largest international companies are Indian. The TCS, Infosys, Wipro, etc. Now, that's another area of growth that is very, very necessary. And again, the system must be flexible enough to provide the flexibility which these companies need. Don't start putting in restrictions about when people can go out, when people can come in, etc. So there are things that we can do which can accelerate growth in modern services and in manufacturing. And modern services don't have to be just infotech. It could be in health services, it could be even in law. There are people who are using law services in India for because we have so lots of labor, skilled labor. But in the end, it is education. Without improving our education system, we will not get anywhere. I think one of the greatest differences I see between India and China is the difference in the education and health systems. And they started their boom in the 80s when they had already spent a huge amount of money in better education for the people, quality education, and also quality healthcare. So I would say human resources, technology, and export orientation. Yes, next one.
In the startup ecosystem, should companies be imposed with MRTP Act? How good are monopolies for an economy?
No, because in many ways, today the whole focus of monopoly control is not the old one saying, oh, you have 50% of the market, therefore you should be out. What the thing that you have to do is to basically see whether the system allows a competitor to shake you up. Yes, today a company like Amazon is a very big company when it comes to e-commerce. But in order to survive, it has to operate efficiently, because if it does not, the competitor can easily come in because the cost of entry, the market is very low. I don't need to set up big shops and so on. I can start from nothing. Look at the number of companies. Look at something like Airbnb. Airbnb was started with a very low cost, and it is today competing very effectively with the old hotel companies. So I would say the thing to do for competition is to make sure that nothing is being done by anybody to prevent others from entering. And that is the essential thing that I think is now understood, that the degree of competition, there must be no barriers to entry. You must not do anything, setting up a standard so that nobody else can enter that area. So this is what is necessary. I don't think the old MRDP is the answer. The new system of monopoly management, where you look at what are the barriers to new people coming in, that is what we should focus on.
Okay, thank you, sir. And the next question is, what is the key element involved in managing the seed fund for any manufacturing firm to grow and purpose?
I would say that I'm difficult to identify key for any one, but basically, my remaining competitive globally is not a static thing. It's a continuous affair. You take, for instance, something like cell phones. They're continuously being improved. So you must have the capacity for continuous improvement in whatever you're doing. Okay, I start off, I have something nice. But then if I think that that's going to be enough forever, I'll be gone. I must have the capacity for continuous change and innovation. This today is the real message of today's, not just industry, even services. And one of my fears in the Indian infotech sector is that with artificial intelligence coming in machine learning coming in, what they have survived on, which is their capacity to provide a great deal of low-cost coding and so on, labor for coding and so on, will become obsolete. They need to start becoming players in the artificial intelligence game, in the machine learning game, in the big data game. I don't see that as yet. So I would say this pressure for continuous innovation is, to me, the true seed of what every company must look for.
Okay, sir. So, sir, the next question is, will the giant company like Walmart, Amazon will influence the growth of small startup ecosystem in a negative way?
I would say yes and no. Yes, because obviously they have the resources to outcompete by offering this discount, offering that discount, and so on. And they're capable of taking losses for a decade, whereas the new startup can't afford to do that. But the difference, the reason why I'm not entirely, they are establishing a market. What they've done is they've created a market for e-commerce. In the sense that there are people who have gotten used to using e-commerce to buy this and that. Now, if I come in as a niche player, like let's say I'm a niche player who supplies quality mangoes or something like this, then I can succeed. Why? Because people have gotten used to using e-commerce. Whereas previously they were not used to. They would not have looked at me in the old days. But now, because so many people using Amazon and other e-commerce sites, a new player can start influencing things, but you must always be ready for innovation. And you must know what that niche is. But I think there is a lot of scope. I think the positive side is this creates opportunities for niche players. The other plus point is, yes, they may be big, but they are providing opportunities for small producers and small suppliers, which was not available to them earlier. Look at the number of small suppliers of selling things through these e-commerce sites. So you're right that e-commerce is an industry where it tends to be dominated by, if I have a product, an infotech product, which is 5% better than the next person's, I'll wipe him off from the market. So there are issues of that nature. But I think there are lots of plus points also.
Okay, so sir, this is the last question as we have limited time. Given the Indian conditions, will Keynesian approach be better than laissez-faire approach?
I would say that given the Indian condition, we need a simple laissez-faire approach won't work. Because we are still in an environment where we need a lot of governmental involvement, not in the negative sense, but in the positive sense, partly through the regulatory system, partly through the fact is we must be realistic. 70% of our banking assets are owned by the government. Now that's a very big chunk. Look at life insurance. More than 2/3 of life insurance is owned by the government. So the government is not just a regulator. The government is a major economy player in our country. And I think to move ahead, we need something which is a little more flexible than the old system of tight regulation, but not all the way down to the laissez-faire system. I don't think we are too badly off right now, frankly. I think right now we have a fairly, the problem today is that we have the uncertainties created by policy changes being too frequent. And I think our challenge today, if I could say, is basically to get back into that same spirit of wanting to move ahead rapidly that we saw in the period 2004 to 2010. That spirit is missing now. Corporates are being very shy. Some of them are even trying to get to go abroad. Now that is what we have to try and change. Make life a little easier for the investor. But more than anything else, the future of India lies in you people, young people. Your capacity, your intelligence, and how do I allow that to flourish? This is why I was focusing so much on a new structure for MSMEs and something with get high net worth individuals in India more involved in the angel investor funding, in venture capital, and so on. So I hope that you youngsters will do the right thing and become the entrepreneurs which we are all looking forward to. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. We got this wonderful opportunity to listen to you and learn from you. Such an amazing session. Thank you for giving
sir.
us
Thank
your
you on
valuable
behalf
time.
of the entire college, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you to all the participants for being such a lovely audience. Thank you so much.